Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar that will be covering the components of a quantitative methodology chapter. My name is David, and I'll be giving the presentation today. And just before we begin with the presentation, I'd just like to take an opportunity to provide some contact information in case you're interested in additional help or support after the presentation. So you can see our phone number, email address, and schedule link here in case you're interested in additional services that we provide in addition to this free presentation today. And so here is an overview of what we will be covering in this presentation. First, I'll be briefly discussing the purpose of the methodology chapter. So why do we need a methodology chapter and why is it important? And then I'll dig into the components of the methodology and discuss specifically what information needs to go in each component of the chapter. So we'll cover the introduction, the research design, discuss the population and sample, instrumentation, data collection and analysis procedures, limitations, and ethical considerations. And then at the end, we'll have time for some questions. So if you do have questions during the presentation, you may type them into the questions section. And any questions that aren't answered over the course of the presentation, we may have a chance to answer those at the end during the questions section. Okay, so to start off, what is the purpose of the methodology chapter? The methodology chapter describes how you will be conducting your research. So the previous chapters that lead into the methodology, namely the introduction and literature review, establish the why for your research. So why are you conducting this research? Why is there a need for it? When you get to the methodology, you move from the why to the how. You should be discussing how you will be conducting your research to answer the questions that you set out in your previous chapters. And so the methodology should be a detailed plan that others can follow if they ever wanted to replicate your research. The information in the methodology should be detailed enough so that somebody else could read your methodology and replicate the study themselves. You really want to think of the methodology as kind of like a recipe or maybe even an instruction manual that you are writing so that you give other researchers a set of instructions or blueprint that they can follow if they ever wanted to replicate your study. And one thing to keep in mind throughout the process of writing your methodology is that every school, even every committee, is different in terms of the requirements that they will have for the methodology chapter. So you will always want to check your school guidelines, your committee's requirements, and make sure that you defer to those as you are constructing your chapter. It will be covering kind of the core components that's common in almost all methodology chapters, regardless of specific school guidelines. But you do want to make sure that you are aware of any guidelines that your school has for the chapter in case those have specific requirements that aren't covered in this general overview. So let's now dig into the actual components of the chapter and start with the introduction. The introduction is pretty simple. You're really just reorienting the reader to the purpose of your study, your research questions, and giving a preview of what the chapter is going to cover. So typically in the introduction, you start off by restating your purpose of the study or your study problem statement, as well as your research questions and hypotheses. And typically, especially with the research questions and hypotheses, you want to just restate these verbatim. your research questions and hypotheses should be stated exactly the same every time they appear in your dissertation. The purpose and the problem statement, depending on your school and your committee requirements, can either be restated verbatim or paraphrased from the previous chapters. And then once you have established or reoriented your reader to your study purpose and research questions, you typically end the introduction by just giving an overview of the content that is going to appear in the chapter. So it's really just a short paragraph that says, this chapter will be covering the following things. It'll be covering the research design, the population, the sample. So it's really just a list of the sections that will appear in the chapter. So now, next, let's talk about the research design. And sometimes, again, depending on the specific requirements or guidelines for the school, you might also talk about the methodology more generally in addition to the research design. Some schools will require that you talk about both. Some will only require you to talk about the specific research design. So if you're required to talk about the methodology, that would be having to do with the rationale between choosing a quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methodology. That's more general than the specific research design, which would be within a quantitative methodology, which specific research design did you choose and why is it appropriate for your study? So you'll want to start off by stating the research design that you did choose. So this could be something like correlational, experimental, quasi-experimental, or causal comparative, just as some examples. Some schools will have very specific terms or verbiage they want you to use to refer to the specific types of research designs. So that's something to be aware of as well. And then after you state your research design, you want to explain why the design was selected, why it was appropriate for your study. You want to relate the design back to your research questions, your problem or purpose statement, and the variables that you are studying in order to rationalize why you chose this specific design. So maybe, for instance, if you're doing a correlational study, you picked a correlational design because you're interested in examining relationships between variables. And that would be the case if you had a research question that specifically says, what is the relationship between this variable and that variable? So your choice of the research design should be specifically aligned to your research questions, problem, purpose, and variables. And then some schools may want you to discuss other types of designs, and they may want you to explain why you did not select other potential types of designs. So if you chose a correlational design for your study, you may need to explain why you didn't choose an experimental design. So why wasn't an experimental design appropriate for your study? Maybe it wasn't feasible for you to conduct an experimental study, or maybe that does not align with the purpose of your study or your research questions. So you may need to go into explaining why you didn't choose other types of specific research designs. And if you had a more a requirement for a more general methodology portion, in addition to the research design, you would follow a similar format to this in that you would explain why you chose a quantitative study. How does that align with your problem, purpose, research questions? And why did you not choose a qualitative or a mixed method study? So that covers the research design portion. Now we can talk about the population and the sample section. So this is where a lot of students may get confused in terms of the difference between the population and the sample, and some students may actually use the term interchangeably or say something like population sample. They're two different things, and it's important to distinguish between the two. So the population is the broad group of individuals or people that your results are intended to generalize to. So if you want to think of the population, if you want to use an analogy, you could say that the population might be the entire ocean of fish. If you were studying fish in the ocean, the population might be the entire ocean, and your sample might just be an aquarium containing a couple of different types of fish from that ocean. So the population is the broader group of individuals that you're generalizing to. And in the population section, you just want to state what the population of interest is. So maybe your population, for instance, is just ER nurses in the Midwestern United States. Or it could be all ER nurses in the United States. It doesn't necessarily have to be confined to a particular region. And then you'll want to briefly describe, if possible, the characteristics of the population in general and provide an estimate of the population size. So if you are studying ER nurses, for example, you may want to give some kind of estimate with a citation of how many ER nurses are there in the Midwestern United States or in the United States in general, to give the reader a sense of the characteristics and number of people that are in the population. So now let's talk about the sample. The sample are specifically the individuals or people that are selected from the population who will actually participate in your study. So again, going back to the ocean analogy, if our population is the entire ocean, then the aquarium would be our sample. And so you'll want to state specifically what individuals you will choose from the population to conduct your study and how you will select those individuals. You'll first want to describe your sampling strategy or technique, which could either be a random or probability sampling technique or a non-probability sampling technique such as convenience sampling. Random sampling involves, as it sounds, you're just randomly selecting individuals from the greater population to be in your study, whereas convenience sampling involves selecting individuals not based on probability or not in some kind of random fashion, but you're selecting individuals that are readily available to you. So you're selecting through a process that is convenient. And you want to describe how the sample is going to be selected from the population and recruited into your study. So you want to be very specific in terms of how you are going to identify individuals from the population to contact to invite into your study. So how will you be reaching out to these individuals? How will you be informing them about your study? Will you be using email or social media? If so, what types of social media? If you're emailing participants, how are you getting their email addresses? Maybe you're using something like flyers, where you're posting flyers in certain locations to let people know about the study. You'll want to be specific about what information is going to be on the flyer and where the flyers are going to be posted. And you also want to let people know, how participants are going to be able to contact you to express their interest in the study once you have sent them an invitation. And then another part of the sample section should be calculating your target sample size. So you will want to calculate and state the target sample size that you will need for the study. And generally with a quantitative study, you would use a power analysis to do this. So you use a program such as GPower to calculate the number of participants that you need in order to conduct your analysis. Right, so now let's talk about the instrumentation. So the instrumentation is the part of the study where you discuss how you will be measuring your variables of interest. And so for each variable, you will want to describe what instrument you will use to measure that variable. If you're doing a survey study, this may involve having one or more different survey instruments, and you want to describe each survey instrument that you're using and the details of that instrument. So specifically, if it is a survey instrument, you want to include information such as how many items or questions the survey has, including giving examples of items from the survey so that the reader can get a sense of what types of questions are asked. You'll want to provide the response scale and scoring. So how are people responding to the items? Are they responding on a 1 to 5 scale, a 1 to 7 scale? Are they giving some kind of other response? And how is the instrument scored? So if participants are answering 10 Likert type questions on a 1 to 5 scale, how are you going to score that information? Are you going to take an average of the responses? Are you going to sum their responses? Is there some other type of scoring that you're going to be using to derive a score that will be your measure for the variable of interest? So you really want to give as much detailed information as possible about each instrument that you're using and how it's being used to measure each of the variables. So there should be discussion relating the instrument back to each of the variables that you have in your study. And in addition to instruments measuring the variables of interest, this is also where you would talk about any demographic information that you're going to collect from participants. So in this section, you will also want to discuss any demographic questions that you will ask in addition to the instruments that you're using to measure your variables. And then you will also want to provide information about the validity and reliability of the instruments. And sometimes schools will actually have the validity and reliability as their own separate sections outside of the instrumentation, or sometimes they want you to discuss the validity and reliability within the instrumentation section. Whatever the case may be, for each instrument that you're using, you want to discuss evidence for its validity and reliability. And generally that information is found in the article that talks about the development of the instrument. So for validity, you might be looking for something like the results of a factor analysis or correlations with other similar measures to establish the instrument's validity. And then for reliability, most of the time, this would be a Cronbach's alpha or similar reliability coefficient, or it could come in the form of correlations such as a test-retest correlation or a split half correlation to test the instrument's reliability. But again, typically information for both of these things, for both validity and reliability, that information will be found in the original article that describes how the instrument was created. So now we'll cover the data collection procedures. And this is really where you get into the instruction manual or recipe type section of the methodology, where you really want to be detailed and describe step by step how you are going to collect the data. And again, keeping in mind that you should provide enough details so that someone else could read your methodology chapter and be able to repeat the study themselves. So you'll want to describe how and where the data collection will take place, especially if you're differentiating between an in-person study or an online study. So if you're doing a survey, for instance, are participants taking the survey in person? So are you actually going to a location and distributing paper copies of the survey, or are you conducting the study online? So are you just sending people an email with a survey link? You'll want to describe, in any case, what that process will look like. So how are participants being contacted? How are they entering the study? How are they receiving the instruments or the materials that they will be using to provide data? You'll also want to discuss how the participants are going to be providing informed consent. So again, this could be either in person or online. Typically, before participants answer any questions or you collect any data from them, they will read a consent form so that they are informed about the purpose of the study, so that they may make an informed decision on whether they want to participate or not. And typically, participants, after they're informed about the study, will provide their consent by either signing a form or endorsing some item, in the case of an online survey, that says, I understand the study and I agree to participate. And then you'll want to discuss how and when each instrument will be administered. So if you're using several survey instruments, what order will the instruments be presented in? If you are doing something like a pre-test and a post-test study, when will the pre-test occur and when will the post-test occur? How much time will elapse between the pre-test and the post-test? And also, if you're doing something like a pre-test or a post-test study, or any kind of repeated measure study, you will want to describe how participants' responses will be linked together so that you're able to link the pre-test response and the post-test response. So are you going to be assigning identification numbers to the participants in order to link their responses together? You'll want to describe that process. And then you'll also want to briefly describe how participants will exit the study, if that is applicable. So when they reach the end of the survey, will they receive a debriefing message, or will they receive information about how they may access the results of the study? Or if it's an in-person study, how are they exiting the study? And then after you describe your data collection procedures, you can go into your data analysis plan. So this would start from, you've collected all of the data, you have participants' responses. From there, how are you going to analyze that data? So first, you'll want to describe how the data are going to be compiled or entered into an electronic format that you'll use for the analysis. So if you're doing an online survey, it may just be as simple as downloading a spreadsheet from the online survey service, if you collected responses in person, then you may have to manually enter the responses into an electronic format. So you'll want to describe that process. You'll also want to briefly state the software that you're using for the data cleaning and the analysis. So if you're using something like SPSS or Excel, you'll want to state what software you're using. Then you'll want to describe how you're going to clean or prepare the data for analysis. So you'll want to talk about things like, how are you going to check the data for accuracy to make sure that all of the responses are accurate? So you'll also want to talk about how you're going to deal with missing responses. If someone didn't fill out a question, or if someone skipped multiple questions, how are you going to deal with that missing data? Are you going to just exclude anybody who was missing any questions? Or are you going to try to replace their missing responses in some way? You'll want to describe in detail how you are going to clean that data to account for any inaccurate responses or any missing data before you get to the analysis. And then once you've talked about the data cleaning, you can talk about descriptive statistics that you're going to conduct to characterize the data. So this is where you talk about any descriptive statistics that you would run on demographic information, as well as your actual study variables. And then you'll want to get into the analyses that you'll actually use to answer each research question and hypothesis for your study. So generally, this just goes in order, or you can even restate your research questions and hypotheses in some cases. And for each one, state what analysis you are going to do. You'll want to state the analysis, state what the independent and dependent variables are in each analysis, and provide a rationale for why you chose that analysis. Why is that analysis appropriate to answer that research question? Then you'll want to describe the details of the analysis. Again, describing the independent and dependent variables. You'll want to describe the level of statistical significance that you're using. So generally in the social sciences, this would be 0.05, but maybe if you're conducting multiple statistical tests, you may need to do some kind of correction for multiple tests, like a Bonferroni correction. You'll want to describe, if you're doing such a correction, any details about that and what your adjusted significance level will be. And you'll want to describe the specific tests that you're using to address the questions. So how are you going to make a determination to address each hypothesis? And what are the measures of effect size that you're going to be looking at as well? And for each analysis, you'll also want to describe the assumptions that will be tested. So these statistical assumptions of the analysis that need to be met to ensure that the results of the analysis can be interpreted accurately. So for something like a t-test, that might involve testing the assumptions of normality and homogeneity of variance. So in that case, you want to describe how you're testing normality, how you're testing homogeneity of variance, and what you might do if any of those assumptions are violated. Whether that may be doing some kind of transformation to the data or doing an alternative test like a non-parametric test. So next, and this is a section that may or may not be required. Some schools will require a section on limitations. Some schools won't require this in the methodology because sometimes this is discussed in earlier chapters, but sometimes schools will want you to discuss specifically the methodological limitations of your study. So this would be limitations related to the research design that you chose. So different types of research designs will have different limitations associated with them. So for instance, if you're doing a correlational study, the main limitation of that would be that you can't determine cause and effect in a correlational study. You can just determine if a relationship exists, you can't determine if one variable causes the other necessarily. In survey studies, you may want to talk about limitations relating to response biases. So, for instance, social desirability bias or biases relating to self-report. So if you're asking people to self-report certain things, that may be less accurate than measuring those things directly. And in repeated measure studies, such as pre and post studies, you may have limitations related to attrition, testing effects, history, or maturation. And in experimental studies, some limitations might stem from external validity. So the extent to which the results of your study can be generalized to more real world situations as opposed to the experimental conditions of the study. So you'll want to discuss the limitations that are relevant to your design. And if possible, you'll want to discuss anything that you are doing to mitigate those limitations. So for instance, in a survey study, if you talk about response biases, you may want to talk about how you are mitigating response bias, such as social desirability bias, by making your survey anonymous if possible, or assuring your participants that their responses are going to be confidential so that your participants will be more comfortable answering the questions honestly. And then usually at the end of the methodology is when you discuss the ethical considerations of the study. So these would be any issues or considerations relevant to your study that relate to protecting your participants. And a lot of times schools will want you to discuss the principles of the Belmont Report, which kind of outlines modern ethics that should guide empirical research. And so the Belmont Report discusses things like beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. Those would be the main three principles that you may want to discuss in relation to your study and how those principles are being upheld in your study. You'll want to discuss the fact that your study will, in all likelihood, need approval from an institutional review board or IRB, and just state that you'll be getting approval for the study procedures before collecting the data. You'll want to discuss how participants will provide informed consent, or if they're not providing informed consent, why is it not necessary for them to provide informed consent? You'll want to discuss what types of information the informed consent will contain. So how will participants be informed about the study? We'll also want to talk about the risks that are involved in the study. So if you're doing just an online survey, for instance, the risks may be minimal. It doesn't mean that there's no risk. It just means that the risks associated with your study would generally not be greater than what participants may experience just in their everyday lives. But you usually shouldn't say something like there's no risk in the study, because that's not really true. Every study has some kind of risk. It's just that your study may have minimal risk. So if you are doing a minimal risk study, you'll want to state how the study is minimal risk, so that you're just doing an online survey. and participants aren't expected to encounter any risk that's greater than what they might encounter in their everyday lives. Or if your study does involve more risk than that, you'll want to go into detail about what the risks are and how you're mitigating those risks. This would also be where you discuss issues related to vulnerable populations. If you're studying any vulnerable populations, this would include people such as elderly individuals, minors, so children, individuals who are under 18 years old, incarcerated individuals, individuals with disabilities. So any individuals who are at a higher risk than the normal population, and generally the institutional review board will have specific definitions for what individuals are considered to be vulnerable. And if your study does involve vulnerable populations, you'll want to go into detail about how you are going to be protecting those individuals. And more generally, you'll want to discuss how participants' identities and information are going to be protected. So if you're doing an anonymous survey, you'll want to state that the survey is going to be anonymous and you're not collecting personally identifying information. If for some reason you do have to collect identifying information, such as participants' names or contact information, you will want to describe how you are going to keep that information confidential and secure. So you want to discuss issues such as how the data is going to be protected and stored. If it's electronic data, you might want to talk about how the data is going to be stored on a password protected computer, or it's going to be stored in an encrypted cloud storage. Or if it's paper and pencil data you actually collect in person, you'll want to describe where that data is going to be stored, where are you going to store the surveys, how is it going to be kept secure. And you'll also want to talk about who the data will be shared with, if it's going to be shared with anyone other than yourself. So for instance, if you have to share it with committee members or statisticians for the purposes of data analysis, who's going to have access to the data? And then how are you going to deal with the data or destroy the data after the study is over? And generally, schools will have guidelines for how long you should keep the data or how long you're required to keep the data after your study is completed. And that pretty much does it for the components of the methodology section. So again, those are really the core components of the quantitative methodology section, what you will generally be required to report for that chapter. Again, your school guidelines may be a little bit different, or they may not require some of those sections, or they may require additional sections. So again, always defer to your school guidelines to know exactly which sections are appropriate for you to include. And again, here's our contact information in case you are interested in additional support. Outside of this webinar, we do provide one-on-one support specifically for quantitative methodology in addition to other chapters of the dissertation. So if you are interested in that service, we do encourage you to contact us. And with that, we'll get into some questions. So the question is, necessity of power analysis in case of a voluntary sample. So generally, power analysis isn't dictated by whether the sample is voluntary or not, but it's dictated by the type of analysis you're doing. For most quantitative studies, you'll want to use a power analysis to calculate the proper sample size. And if you're using a program like GPower, you would input information about the analysis you're conducting. So what type of test you're doing, whether it's an ANOVA or a t-test or a regression, information about the variables in that analysis. So like how many variables there are, there might be other specific parameters depending on the type of analysis that you're doing. How many groups you're comparing, for instance, if you're doing something like an ANOVA. And then information about the level of power that you're required to have for the study. Generally in the social sciences, that would be 0.80 or 80%, and the level of significance that you are aiming for. So again, in the social sciences, that's generally set to 0.05 or 5% type 1 error rate. And you'd enter that information into GPower, and GPower would give you a target sample size for that analysis. Okay. The next question is, what criteria is used to determine that a study is dissertation worthy? So that would that's going to depend on a lot of different things, and this kind of goes back to even previous chapters, not just the methodology, but the selection of your topic and your research questions as well. So you have to kind of establish that there is a problem that you're addressing by your study, and through the literature kind of describe what that problem is and develop research questions based on that. And in terms of the methodology, in terms of it being dissertation worthy, different schools and committees will have different requirements. Some schools and committees will require you to have a certain number of research questions. So I've seen some schools that say, you need at least 2 research questions, or you need at least this many variables. So that's something to keep in mind. Some schools will also have requirements for the complexity of the analysis that you're doing, which would again be kind of determined by the nature of your research questions and the number of variables that you have. I've seen feedback from some committee members that say something like, you can't just do one t-test, or you can't just do a Pearson correlation, you have to do something more complicated than that. So that's something to keep in mind, is you can come up with a very simple, straightforward question, like, is there a difference between 2 groups on a variable, or is there a relationship between 2 variables, and come up with a very simple analysis to answer that question. But your school may require you to do something more complex than that. So the next question is, can you briefly explain once again how to prepare the data for analysis? So the data cleaning and preparation has to do with, basically, once you have the raw data, what do you need to do with the data in order to get it ready to actually run your analysis, or run the analysis that you're doing to answer the research questions. And typically that involves assessing the data for accuracy, especially if you are manually entering the data. So for instance, if you collected data in person using paper and pencil questionnaires and had to manually enter the data into an electronic format, you'll want to check that data for accuracy to make sure everything was entered correctly. And then you'll also want to check the data for missing responses. That's another big part of cleaning the data, is looking at how many missing responses you have, and having a plan in place to deal with those missing responses. So are you going to just eliminate participants who are missing any data so you're only left with participants who answered every single question? Or are you going to try to keep participants who are missing some data but replace their missing responses in some way, such as through a mean replacement or an imputation? So those are generally the things that you'd want to consider in data cleaning. Okay, so if there are any other questions, you can feel free to type those questions in now. So the question is, when is the Bonferroni correction not necessary? The Bonferroni correction would not be necessary if you're just doing one test, or in some cases, if you're doing very few tests, you may not need to do something like a Bonferroni correction. Generally, people will want to do something like a Bonferroni correction when you're doing many, many tests. So if you're doing like 10 or more t-tests, for instance, that's a lot of tests, and the more tests you do, the greater the chance you have of getting a significant result purely due to chance. Because if you're using, for instance, a significance level of 0.05, which would correspond to a type 1 or false positive rate of 5%, if you did 100 different tests, you would expect 5% of those to turn out significant just by chance, even if there's no real effect or relationship there. So as the number of tests that you're doing increases, the concern about multiple tests and the consideration of doing something like a Bonferroni correction would become more important. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you're only doing a few tests, like maybe one test for each research question, you may not need to worry about doing a Bonferroni correction. But if you find that you're doing, 10, 20, t-tests or something like that, or 10 or 20 correlations, then that's when you might want to consider doing some kind of correction for the type 1 error rate. So the next question is, I've seen some power analyses that required a relatively small n, but it seems to be insufficient for a dissertation. Will a larger n than what is noted by G power be better? So that may be a concern in some cases, especially if you're doing a repeated measures analysis, which generally statistically require fewer participants because they're a more powerful analysis. And some schools I've seen will actually have a requirement for the number of participants that you have, regardless of the type of analysis that you're doing. So for instance, a school might say that if you're doing a quantitative study, you need at least 100 participants, and that's regardless of the analysis that you're doing. So if your G power says you only need 50 people to do this type of analysis, but your school says you need at least 100 participants, regardless of the analysis that you're doing, then you will want to defer to your school requirement. That being said, there is a concern with your sample size being too large, and that if your sample size is extremely large, you may find significant results just by virtue of the sample size being so large. So kind of the way statistical significance works is that the larger your sample size, the more likely you are to find statistically significant results. And if your sample size becomes extremely large, then even very small effects or differences or relationships will become significant just because the sample size is so big. So it's not really a matter of, the bigger sample size necessarily being better in all cases. Generally, if you can get more participants than your target sample size, that's not a bad thing, but something that you should keep in mind is that if your sample size becomes large to an extreme, you can kind of have the problem of everything turning out significant just because the sample size is so big. But again, you will want to defer to your school and if they have any specific requirements for the number of participants you need. So the next question is, how do we access GPower? GPower is freely available online. If you just Google, if you just type GPower into a search engine, you should be able to find it. It's a free program that you can download and use yourself. And we actually had a previous webinar covering power analysis and GPower, and we may have that webinar again in the future. And also, if you use our Intellectus statistics software, we have templates for power analysis within that software that are based on GPower. So you could do power analysis calculations in Intellectus without having to download GPower or know how to use GPower specifically. But in short, the answer is that you can just find GPower online. It's free to use and download. Okay, so are there any other questions? Okay, doesn't look like I'm getting any other questions coming in. So with that, again, I'll just say thanks everyone for attending today's session. And again, if you are interested in additional help, we do have other webinars available covering different topics as well. So keep an eye on our list of webinars for more topics that may be helpful to you. And also, again, you can use this contact information shown here to get in touch with us if you're interested in the additional support that we offer. So again, thank you everyone for attending today, and I hope everyone has a great day.